Welcome back to Living the City, our double feature lecture series. Living the City is an exhibition, it's a publication, it's a program of events, and it's a discursive platform about cities, people, and stories. The setup for this format is always the same. We are here together for 60 minutes, 1 hour. Both of you will give a presentation of roughly 10 minutes. And other than that, we'll engage in a little conversation about your work. Today, two guests with me. That's Jennifer Aksu, a cultural scientist and a curator. And no, cultural scientist is you, actually, if you may so speak. Lutz Henke, and a curator, an urbanist and a cultural manager. That's you, Jennifer Aksu. I think the common denominator in our conversation today will be, amongst many other things, the intersection of urban space, art, and city making on both on an institutional as well as a non-institutional level. I'm thrilled to have you with me. Jennifer, we are actually meeting for the very first time. I came across your work just kind of researching in the field, and I think we have a lot of shared interest in public space and urban space. You just had an opening in Hamburg this weekend as part of the Imagine the City project in the Hafen City, as well as another opening last week here in Berlin at Haus der Statistik, a project that we also feature here in the exhibition. That is called Urbane Praxis 12+1 Berlin projects. I'm thrilled to have you here. You have a background in theater and in communications. You graduated, however, in a studies called Urban Culture, Society and Space. You are co-founder of Invisible Playground, which is a network for playful public spaces. And as an urbanist and a cultural manager, you are interested in collective and experimental design processes in relation to the built environment or the urban realm, let's say. And as such, you consult a lot, you teach, you curate, and you always work on questions about urban relations with various organizations from within the art world, but also within culture and city councils. They're always in moments of transition or transformation. That said, thank you for being here, and the screen is yours.
Thanks, Lukas, for having me and also matching me with Lutz, who I haven't seen in over 10 years, which is great to meet again. Working in the same city, still sometimes not really crossing the pathways. You said half of my text, which is great, so maybe I'm not going to use all of those 10 minutes. As you said, my name is Jennifer Aksu, and I'm interested in the question, how can urban spaces become more flexible and inclusive? In other words, also like this exhibition is framing it, how can cities, but also rural places, be more resilient and future-oriented? I have a background, as you said, in theater science and an allergy, which is always coming up in June. But then I graduated in something that is called Urban Culture, Society and Space, which is a model studies that hasn't outlived its 5 years recent program, because I think this intersection of arts, cultural production, sociology, and the urban space is super complicated in a way, and there's a lot of people who do not really know what to work in with this kind of mixture. At the same time, I felt super much at home in that because I co-founded Invisible Playground, as you said, which is by now, or since 2017, a network embracing people from various backgrounds, from psychology, from cultural science, from game design, but also from the urban sphere, working at the intersection of game design, systems thinking, and cities. So, as you rightly put it, I'm working with arts and governmental institutions, as well as NGOs, also subculture and underground cultural formations, collectives, worldwide, and also in all kinds of project scales, from one-day projects with only a few people to projects that run for years and involve hundreds of people. I think I have to always stress that I do not have a background in game design, so I didn't graduate in game design, but games do bring something together that I think for making cities is the ideal combination of skills. So the skill set of game designers is just the best fit for making cities. Why? I'll explain that in a while. My work is not about gamification, which I always stress, and it's not about how do we make more efficient places, or how do we make people more efficient through external incentives, such as you remember, maybe the Volkswagen project with those sound making staircases when you walked up. This is not the work I'm doing. Let's see, what we're working on is, as we call it, the invisible playgrounds. We believe that game design as a methodology, or at least I personally believe, that this kind of methodology, the art of making games, shapes how we organize processes and also connections, making them a lot more meaningful, engaging, and also human-centered. This is a project I did in 2012 on a little island in the Netherlands with 200 people each day, 10 days long, and the playing field was washed away by the tide. So you had a design constraint, which was the natural force of the water, and this is definitely broadening the sense of what nature does or what tide actually means in this kind of natural context. At least those 200 people went home and they were all, wow, this is what happens. That was me, right? Okay. That's also a project I did as the strategist for innovations from the arts when I was working for the Center of Competences deriving from the cultural economic sphere. It's an initiative by the Federal Ministry for Economies and Energy here in Berlin. And we did a project, we did a game actually that was called Catch the Bus, that was about autonomous driving. So what we simulated was how does the bus actually know how to drive? And I mean, autonomous driving is always this black box that nobody really understands, which is why many people are also in fear of that, and some that do know more about that do push for it. But it's actually not too hard to make people understand how that actually works. And through having this broad understanding through this kind of different system that you involve yourself in, you take away this kind of fear that derives from not knowing what you're actually moving in with. Eric Zimmerman, who is a professor for game design at the NYU in New York, said that a game is a voluntary interactive activity in which one or more players follow rules that constrain their behavior, enacting an artificial conflict that ends in a quantifiable outcome. Game design is always about players, or in economic terms, as I've been working as a strategist at this initiative for the Federal Ministry of Economies, I can't help using their terminology, but I think it's also benefiting to talk about cities with this kind of vocabulary. Games are always about users. As you see, this is a playtest we've been doing within the World Championship of Gameful Architecture in Witten in 2014. And game as an interaction doesn't exist as long as you don't play it. So you have to make people play it and then talk about it. And if people do not play your game because it's not fun, it doesn't really make sense to make this game. And this is very much transferable onto our public spaces or urban spaces. if people do not feel good or if they do not enjoy the places to get together, to chill, you won't have this kind of resilient social cohesion that you need to make places with this kind of good quality of life that all cities are longing for. And this kind of involving people, talking about what's happening, about design, about planning, is something that we embrace in game design, but that we also advise cities to embrace when making cities or making places. And at the same time, this is about research and evaluation a lot, and it's about transparency. So the more you involve people, the more transparent you get. And I think this is a point of discussion we've always been having in democratic systems. And yeah, it's something you can definitely learn from games. This is a feedback situation. We call it iterative design. So games do work in feedback loops. You come up with an idea, and as soon as 20% of the game idea or set is finished, you start playtesting it. This is something that is definitely not thinkable of for cities as they are working right now, because imagine you have something that is finished by 20% and you would ask people to use it, they would always feel weird, or they would always be like, but it doesn't work. And it's okay that it doesn't really work, but through using it and through not understanding why it doesn't work, it's a lot easier to actually understand how or what you should do or what you should need to make people understand the setup and what this place or this game is about. Game design is always about rules. I think this is something that touches upon city making the most, because you have a lot of rules in games, and at the same time you have a long rule set of how to make cities, but also how to move through cities, how to use places. It's all, I don't know if you do use playgrounds a lot, but if you enter a playground in a German city, it always tells you it's not allowed for people over 12, you're not allowed to drink alcohol, please have your dogs on a line, and all those rules are actually ever around you, even if you cannot read them explicitly. But rules in games do have a very other form than just making up constraints. It's a form of democratic power in a way, because rules make everybody start from the same level, at least if it's a new game and everybody and nobody knows it. And it also helps everybody understand what this is about. So this is a rule card of a game we created in 2011 as Invisible Playground in Budapest. And it's half an A5 page, actually. So this is, if you read that and if you understand, you're able to play a rather complicated game about systems of people who are not, who are unwanted in urban spaces. And I think it's, if you get to this point that you can explain people how something works on an A5 page, this is where we start having democratic forms of organization. At the same time, if you understand rules, you can also discuss how to change the rules. You can also discuss how to make rules. And this is something that if cities long for participation, or they always ask, how can we make people get involved into city making? How can we make them take over responsibility for their shared spaces? It's that you need to discuss the rules that you're working on together with. And if people do not understand what rules they are living with and how they can be able to change those rules, it's really hard to actually make them partake. In Germany, I've been working internationally, and in comparison, in Germany, you have this broadened mindset of nothing is possible in the public space. This is what you start from mostly. And it's always this kind of mindset. If you ask city councils for a project in urban space, they always say nothing is possible. We need to discuss exemptions. But in other places, it's a mindset of everything is possible. We just have to discuss. And this kind of users and owners on the other side perspectives, I've started a project together with Gili Karjewski and Sebastian Quack called Playful Commons, where we are thinking about licensing processes to how can you actually, could you license public spaces like you do license digital services with Creative Commons? Then game design is also about conflicts, as Eric put it, even if it's artificial conflicts. At the same time, it's also about challenges and solutions, or at least testing out different ways of getting to a solution. And this kind of trial and error doesn't just occur in games, but also while making games. We call it prototyping, and while everything is getting so flexible and agile, we ask ourselves, or I do ask myself, why does architecture actually have to be so rigid? And this is when we invented a game in this Gemeinmissbrauch thing. I'll just rush through it. This is a game in Berlin. We invented, while prototyping, this game called Just Add People, where you can prototype spaces in one-to-one scale together. And it's been used by universities, but also cultural institutions like Pakt in this case. And it's crazy how to see how people start building differently if they can build one-to-one scale, and if they start understanding how space changes when you interact with it. Last but not least, this is a project I've been doing with the Federal Ministry for Economies and Energy. I've been building a place for all the institutions, but actually only and the people working in the ministry to get together. And this is also what I always closely link to game design or urban games, which is the art of hosting or caretaking for each other, because you invite people to enter a magic circle, how Heusinger puts it, as games. They are entering a new world, and you need to make sure everybody knows how to navigate, whom to approach if they feel unsafe, and if they lose orientation. And this is the same for cities. People who do not know how to navigate and get lost, they change the kind of atmosphere you actually want to have in cities if you get into this kind of unsafe awkwardness in a way. And this is also what cities do need to think about. What kind of atmosphere do we actually want to create? And this kind of atmosphere creation is also closely linked to that games are always about strategies. And Zimmerman talks about a quantifiable outcome. And I've been working, as you said, in the initiative of urban practice in Berlin recently. And while games always have this kind of winning condition, you always know why somebody won a game or lost a game. I observed that those kind of city-making processes do not have this kind of awareness for impact or for this kind of transformation, and that you need to have a set of criteria where you can understand that something was like this at the beginning, and when you did your project, it turned out differently, this kind of transformation you talked about. And I think this kind of, as I call it, urban impact index needs to be stronger involved into city making. So how do you actually discuss if a project worked out in city making or not? And this is something I brought for the discussion today, and I'm looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think you touched a lot of subjects that are dear or common to the three of us. With regards to this exhibition, I think it's very much at the heart of this exhibition that we are trying to look at actually really what are the rules and how can they be bent. Most of the projects are in a way proactive, so they engage within a given environment, and they challenge that environment. And this is, I think, something that you have been discussing. Then there's another term you dropped, that of strategies. I think I would like to talk about strategies and tactics with both of you, because we can go into more theoretical discourse, but the interventions you've done are almost more tactical than they are strategic. Yes, for the rules of the bigger game, you need these strategies. We have also a project within the exhibition of Ekim Tan, or the group of Ekim Tan, called Play the City, where she tries to integrate also gaming into urban development, or games informing urban development by working with local communities and initiatives. Plus, we have a whole section called Playing, so I'm happy, that we have all these overlaps here. But I was curious now, on a purely personal level, how did you enter into this field? When did your interest for this come about? Is that during the studies that you did on urban culture, or what was the triggering point for you to engage on that level with the city, in particular from the gaming perspective?
I finally entered the Urban Culture, Society and Space Studies after starting Invisible Playground, so after working 10 years in the fields. And I started, as you said, with a background in theater, and I did a lot of cultural production, but never at theaters, but always in urban spaces. And I started a project, Germany-wide project about new music in public spaces, and I ran across one of the co-founders of Invisible Playground within this scale, and he just came back from New York, working in this kind of scene around Pac Manhattan, so the people who actually started to bring video games onto the streets when understanding that the grid system that you're moving in with a Pac-Man on the computer just is the one-to-one set that you have as a grid system of streets in New York. And that was people who were like, well, there's more to those spaces than just going from A to B or sitting in a park having lunch. And I also come from the underground techno scene in a way, where the idea of using rundown spaces, or what you now call lost spaces, and that you actually, as somebody paying taxes, and having somebody in charge for those places still being lost, you just take care of them. And though both scenes do take a lot more care of the spaces around them through observation, through engaging, that at the same time do cater this kind of common caretaking that a government should actually be taking care of. And this kind of empowerment, and also this kind of feeling an agency, because you're not interrupted, is great. I mean, festivals and games is super different, because games is very temporary intervention, and as soon as, whenever the police shows up, you're already done with the game. And it's always also very productive discussion, because the games mostly never change anything in the urban space. It's just the perspective that is changed and your experience in the space.
Thank you, and I would like to take this as the lead to Lutz now, the agency of lost spaces. It's a nice key to you. Lutz, thank you for being here. We just discussed when entering the exhibition, when we have first met, and we're looking back at 14 years as such, around 2008, maybe even before, maybe even 2005, where we were working on similar subjects. In general, I would say that in these 14, 15 years, we've been working parallelly on very, very similar subjects. You are a cultural scientist and a curator. Your focus is urban studies. It's art. It's subcultural art. It's also contemporary society or contemporary reflexivity or history. And we met because you founded an Attitude, which was a program, also an exhibition space at in a way a lost space, the Senatsreservespeicher, where I think over 10, 14 years you set up a lot of exhibitions that were dealing with, let's say, urban art or urban communication in one way or another. And did some really seminal exhibition and works there in public space and with artists in public space. And now since 2016, you work for Visit Berlin, which is like the Berlin's official tourism and congress organization. And there you are the director of culture or the head of cultural affairs. And you try to develop now innovative projects from the more institutional side. So as I said in the beginning, I think what I found particularly interesting in our combination today is that knowledge of both the institutional and the non-institutional, working both with governmental or cultural or city councils, as well as more from the underground side of things. That said, Lutz, thank you for being here. And the screen is yours.
It's a pleasure. Yeah, and after your introduction, it's also really hard to hide the schizophrenic nature of what we're doing in the city. On one side, like really working with institutions, on the other side, working with lost spaces and artists, and let's say somewhere in this gray area in the city, and sometimes also legally. So it's really a lost space, as you said, because it doesn't exist anymore, and it's a space where we used to work for about 10 years and were so successful that we gentrified ourselves out of the neighborhood. And this also was a very interesting experience in theory and practice. So you already said that I'm a cultural scientist and curator, which adds to the schizophrenic existence somewhere between theory and practice. And of course there is the part of the spatial theory, which always was a very interesting framework to think about the city and to think about space, but then also the spatial practice, thinking about how you really could intervene and work with the city. And you asked me to talk a little bit about my work today, which is equally difficult because it's really quite diverse between the institution and working with artists. And so I just brought a medley of a lot of projects and an abundance of pictures, which sometimes are projects which developed over 10, 15 years. And so I think I'm just gonna skim through the images and sometimes tell you about the project. So what I will leave out a little bit is the first part, the theory part, and then rather talk about this practical, about the practice. So it's also one of the things which I would say I enjoy most in this work is working really closely with artists and developing a project from scratch to the catalog text, so to speak. Most of these projects are related to art and the public or the public domain. It's not only urban space, and some of these are more, I think, can be regarded also as aesthetical interventions, a term which I somehow used when I wrote an article about the Berlin Wall and the art on the Berlin Wall, because it was so difficult. Once you're in the public domain, it's so difficult to really define what is art, what is activism, what might be advertisement, or if it's only self-marketing of the artist, which also makes it very interesting because, as you just said, we just met around the same time, about some 12, 14 years ago, all of us, which I find really interesting. But it's also, I think, somehow the purpose of a lot of these works to include people who usually would not participate in, let's say, art which is displayed in an art space or so, and to leave those. And so sometimes it's very hard to define those practices. And so, maybe we can coin them as aesthetic interventions. So, and we just heard about the possibility or the question of which are the rules and how to change them in the city. And you already had a talk about transgressions in the public domain, I think. And you know the old saying of like, learn the rules, then break them. And this is why I find this transgression term also really helpful. It always resonates in my head that there's this Rem Koolhaas article about the Bataille-soaked scholars, but I still find it very useful in a metaphorical and practical way to say which are the borders in public space, in urban space, maybe between countries, but then also in a very metaphorical way, which are the hurdles we have to take and to overcome. So starting with this exhibition space, which you just mentioned, it's not the starting point of it all, but it's 10 years where you had a lot of things happening around the art in public domain, which we were fostering. I wanted to start with this Time for Revolution installation by Nassantur, who also had been a guest of yours here in this talk series already, and it sums up very much the 10 years of the exhibition space as well. The Time for Revolution with a typo somewhere in between revolution and illusion, which was glowing in the dark there over a couple of years. So this is a former reserve of the secret reserves of West Berlin, which we used for about 10 years, and it was exactly one of the lost spaces of Berlin. And as every art space, it started with these illegal parties in the basement and developed from there. Of course, we used it as an exhibition space, but it was even more important that we could go in the public domain or in the city around it, like shaping the neighborhood, but also creating really images which were circulating widely. So there is an exhibition, it was called the Revolution at Service of Poetry with Santiago Sierra, Fernando Sanchez Castillo, and Democracia. And basically the exhibition was inside, but we used a lot of the motifs more or less as like a marketing campaign around the city to include also spectators who would not visit the show. I think a lot of people know this motif. It's a 10-year epic drama. What happened around this piece, it started in 2007 with the artists Blue and JR painting this wall, and I think I can say we did this very naively. And then it escalated from there into an icon for Berlin and Kreuzberg and everything around. We added another wall in 2008. The field in front was squatted. We built the first house with Yukihiro Taguchi there, and it became like a little city. Some called it favela. We had the BMW Guggenheim Lab who wanted to go there. It didn't work out. I worked for the Guggenheim Museum at this time, which was also a very schizophrenic existence. We planned a project with Raul Walch, the Future Living Lab, who also had been a guest of yours already, which then didn't happen because they just evicted the whole squad about, I think, 5 days before we wanted to open and to start, where we then just took down the house again as like of Yukihiro Taguchi and Chiara to just keep something, some time capsule from this field. And then when we had to move out, when we successfully gentrified ourselves out of the neighborhood, and still wear this icon, which was used by all sides, so to speak, right? So there was like an initiative to put this under protection, then there was another one using it for the marketing of the newly built houses, and it was a very strange experience that we had created a very powerful image together with the artist, of course, or the artist, which then escalated into this icon, but you wouldn't have any control of it anymore in public space, which of course is the idea of art in the public domain. But we just decided to take some of this responsibility back and just blacked it out one night to really start a discourse, which worked fairly well. So there is, I wrote a piece for Ephemera, which is still online, and a version of it is also in the Guardian. So this was the first part of the exhibition space I used to run, and now this is more about like physical overcoming hurdles, fences, and borders. a piece with Wärmke Leinkauf, where when I was in the archives researching on the Berlin Wall, we found a lot of documents on the Berlin Wall, which they indeed tested. You know, they made exercises how you would be able to overcome certain types of walls, and it was like very shocking. On one hand, of course, because you know it's the Berlin Wall, and you have indeed people who died at this frontier, and on the other hand, it was like reading like a introduction for a Fluxus action, and so we just redid all these Überwindungsübungen, so the exercises to overcome, in Berlin 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and did the exact same techniques which they tried with the border troops. And this is, for example, this is a remain of the Berlin Wall, indeed. Right before, we had like one of these, houses which they built around the former death strip, and this also used to be part of the Berlin Wall. By the way, I always thought that grappling hooks were kind of like a ninja pun for cartoons, but you also find out that these tools for action in cities, they indeed somehow work, and that's also something which, of course, the helps you. When you do those kind of things. And there's an abundance of discounter supermarkets in the former death strip, which you only realize once you look for them. Then there's another project, which I think it was in 2008 for the Wiesbaden Biennale with Santiago Sierra, where we realized a work we planned for also the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, that it's so easy to build walls nowadays. So there's one of these passive defense mechanism which are still used in countries all over the world, the HESCO bastion, the HESCO containers. And basically you can build a wall like this within, I think we did it in 5 minutes. It was a performance. You can do it like even faster. But the interesting thing was that we were dividing Wiesbaden, and it went like shockingly fast, but at the same time it was like a little bit like a normal people used to adjust to, a little bit like in the former East and West Berlin, and everybody was concerned about the birds, but the birds in the end were the most happy ones because they weren't disturbed anymore. And at the same time, as very often in Santiago Sierra's practice, you have like a very minimal approach of just like drawing a line, which reduces this question a little bit to this very abstract idea of a border. So here you see it a little bit above that it really was a true barrier. And the line again. Another work with Santiago Sierra, I don't know how well you can see it. This is actually a satellite picture we took from, I think, 80 kilometers above, which is really absurd because it shows the Algeria and the areas of where the West Sahara Frente Polisario went into exile. And it is absurd because you wouldn't be allowed to enter Algeria with like tele-optics, neither a drone, so this was in 2012, but you can just call somebody and say, hey, can we take a satellite picture? And they're, oh yeah, sure. The reason why we took the satellite picture is because you might see the outlines of a SOS, which is, to my knowledge, still the world's largest graffiti, because like from the S to the last dot, these are 5 kilometers, and it's 1.7 kilometers high. So the idea there was being invited, Santiago Sierra, by the Sahrawis in Algeria to do a piece. I went there and we said, okay, it has to be something megalomaniac about the forgotten West Sahara conflict. And so the idea was to do the world's largest graffiti. And you see a little bit at the right of the picture, it's not exactly an urban area, but that's one of the refugee camps where they're sitting now for more than 40 years. And now, you know that this, with like Morocco right now, it became quite an actual thing again. Yeah, I'm just gonna skip through it. It's really not exactly an urban practice, but you're still working a lot with space, and it becomes very relevant if you think about like the visual colonization and the picture from from above. And of course, it has a little bit of this land art touch. So the last project, which is even less urban, it's called Black Flag, also a piece with Santiago Sierra, which started as a, again, megalomaniac pun, but then in the end still resulted in me planting an anarchist flag at the North Pole and here at the South Pole, which is a little bit this gesture, to really, being at these two like very symbolic points and having this anarchist statement of Santiago Sierra against, let's say nationalism, and there, many more aspects to the piece. Here's an installation view. So the last part I quickly wanted to touch are like the more festival-esque actions, a little bit what you talked about as well, and these are in the framework of some more institutional work, which I find really interesting because it's more that of a social practice working with artists and cities. So basically a program sponsored by the Foreign Office, all the projects I'm gonna show right now, which we did over the course of 2 years, which is one at the Salone del Mobile in Milano together with Raum, building these forms of turmoil, which of course is a design festival in the Fiori Salone, but they were manufactured to also manifest some, like the needs, the protest in the public domain, and also get to know the city and the initiatives a little bit better. It also was a lot of fun. You could build a lot of structures. And what was also really interesting, I don't know exactly what Axel of Raum expected, but he was really annoyed that everybody wanted to buy his structures and was like, come on, it's a fair. Like, people of course ask you how much things are, but they specifically built the nothing for sale thing because people wouldn't, they couldn't imagine that this wasn't something to just to do for fun in the city. So this was the first project. Another project was a tour on the water. 2 boats. One is like a floating camera obscura with the Triennale für Fotografie in Hamburg, with 2 photographers traveling through Amsterdam, Paris, the photo fairs, giving workshops on like sustainable art and their photography. So one was the camera, one was more the floating living and workshop room. Another tour with Raum was reactivating the Space Buster, which you see here, and this infamous inflatable bubble event space touring the US, and it was called We Like America and America Likes Us, a little bit referring to Beuys and René Bloch, the work they did back there, but I think nobody really got the reference and everybody was happy that we had stickers with We Like America everywhere. So this was really good. And they went to St. Louis, had workshops in the spaces, talked about like city making, of course, how the social space around those communities can be produced and influenced. Yeah, you see one of the bumper stickers of Raum and We Like America. So the last project I wanted to show is in Buenos Aires. There you see a work of Björn Mehlhus in the back, and we really set up like a whole festival, which was called also a little bit megalomaniac, but in the end it really works out Die Informale, because we were thinking about the similarities between Berlin and Buenos Aires, and these are exactly the lost spaces and the informal spaces. And Lucas, you just said it. We had like one of our first touching points was some text about favelas in Rio de Janeiro, where we also thought about like culture in informal spaces, like trickling into society. And in Latin America, you have, of course, the informal city against the official city, something which is still less imaginable that it has a quality. And so we called it Die Informale and really used a lot of these spaces and had some video works from Berlin, from Buenos Aires. We used some of the banks like being still empty after the crash. There's Nassantur again, using these old pools. and really wanted to stress the quality of the informal and what happens when you embrace the unpredictable. What I won't have time to really go through right now, but I just wanted to recommend is a project initiated with Raul Walch as well, called Owned by Others. And we are very lucky, speaking about urban practice, that we can continue the project in Berlin around Museum Island in the next year. And so you're invited to come and to experience it yourselves.
Thank you so much, Lutz. Super inspiring presentation, super inspiring images as well. Unfortunately, we have only 15 minutes left together, so it's very, very short. But I didn't want to interrupt both of your presentations that both so rich of content. But one thing I want to pick up before I have a question for the two of you is the schizophrenic situation, condition, existence, as you called it in your presentation, that we, I guess, all share. I mean, just living in the city is in many ways a schizophrenic one that's constantly torn between like conflict and consensus on many parts. But also picking up on the project that you showed from the Senats Reservespeicher with Blue and JR that you kind of then painted black. And now the schizophrenic situation of being there, working as a curator, working with artists in urban space, and the city then kind of using this image as something to promote itself. And now you being responsible for the cultural affairs, for the tourism here within the city. How do you bridge that kind of that tension, or how do you live that kind of, as you call it, schizophrenic condition, where we have a phenomena, in particular Berlin is known for being like the capital of urban art or the graffiti mecca, which even appears on the website of the city, yet it's still officially in illegal practice. So we slightly touched this in the conversation with Mischa Leinkauf here, but how do you take it?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm also a cultural scientist, and if you see all this as a teilnehmende Beobachtung, like participating in the thing but still watching it, it's kind of a research project, and I think then this works quite well, and it really helps if you know both worlds a little bit, and I don't only mean like theory and practice, but also the existence as a freelance artist, so to speak, but also sitting on the other side of the desk and dealing with stuff like Vergaberecht or something like this. So it makes you understand a lot of the rules which you mentioned, and also find loopholes of how to work to the benefit of both sides. And of course, you're totally right. Thinking of Kevin Lynch, The Image of the City, which kind of already talked about the imaginability of cities, which we now have with Instagram and the Instagrammable image of a city. And of course, these pictures, they are used, but they are also created to be seen. I think the point I really always try to stress is the awareness. So on one side, the artists, they really have to be aware of what they're creating and maybe even taking responsibility for it. A little bit of this was in the action with the Blue piece. But on the other hand, I don't think that administration or state agencies should pay a marketing agency who then just exploits those images. So it's much easier, like if you know each other, to work together. And so that might seem a little bit schizophrenic, but on the other hand, the question is like, how can you change this, or how could there really happen some structural change? And it's kind of a mutual education process. So on the one hand, the creators, they have to adjust a little bit to the not so cool and underground administration, and on the other hand, the administration and marketing also has to think about like the needs of those pieces, and what would be adequate of how to work with it.
Yeah, but I think the interesting part here is that an unsolicited artwork in public space becomes then unsolicitedly reappropriated by the city itself, and then you come into an interesting loop. And that's now for both of you here, that you mentioned a background in kind of an underground techno scene. Here it's very clear that we have a kind of background and affiliation to the kind of urban art, let's call it urban art scene. yet both of you working then for large institutional bodies like the city or city councils. What is your biggest learning from working with these two very different entities? And you mentioned strategies, and I dropped earlier the tactics, and kind of you dropped a few kind of theoretical notions here already. So in Michel Desserteau, there's this idea of you're both familiar with the strategies. That's the kind of the top-down view. That's kind of the master planning, and then actually the way we interact in the urban environment. And Desserteau uses actually the image of a person walking through the city is the tactics. So for me, the invisible playground, the idea that the whole city is the playground, but it's invisible to the normal eye, is more a tactical intervention in a certain way. But yeah, both of you, maybe you could briefly elaborate on again that position in between institutional and non-institutional, in between strategies and tactics. And start with you, Jennifer.
As an opener, you ask about what is our biggest learning in working with informal groups or freelance groups or non-institutional groups and bigger institutions like federal ministries or cities. And my biggest learning is definitely that it is all about people. It's not an institution. There is 150 people sitting there. Everybody with their own needs, with their own perspectives, with their own values. And when talking to a colleague, a professor in urban design in Greece, we discussed a lot that if you want to take care of a place, you need to take care of the dynamics of the place. And this is, I think the biggest learning is that it's all about dynamics. It's how you mediate between the dynamics of a city, who is in charge, that everybody has actually the same say, that a city is liable for what happens in its city. They are liable for the security of everybody. And at the same time, you have all those individual needs of users who want to, use spaces to their individual benefit. And you always have to mediate between those. And I see our job as mediating between those dynamics and making people understand that it's how you organize those dynamics will also mirror into how spaces are taking responsibility over or how they are organized.
But these dynamics you regard as the same? I mean, it's a very, let's say, general term of a dynamic, but within the non-institutional or institutional, you feel at the end of the day it's just dynamics and people, if you boil it down.
At the end of the day, it is about dynamics when it comes to a certain level of openness, for example. Mm-hmm. And the way you approach rule making or rule breaking, for example, and I would always say it's not just about rules and how to break those rules or understand and break those rules, but also about a discussion, how can we make rules together and why are rules made like they are, and how can we change this kind of structure maybe that lies behind this understanding of rules or making of rules.
So how about you, Lutz?
I think what you just described as that strategy is a little bit what I was referring to as the awareness, because I think when you engage with the public, you can't avoid that you might be, or whatever you create, it might be used in a different way than you intended to. I mean, if you put it to an extreme, every squat is a marketing campaign. If you look at Christiana or even Kuvristrasse, I mean, for this was something which also was screaming, hey, this is a free place, everybody come to Berlin. And you wouldn't be able to avoid it. That's also what I was referring to when I talked about we were so successful that we gentrified ourselves out of the neighborhood. We decided to engage with the public, we decided to paint these walls, and suddenly they become the beacon and the icon for this place. And this was completely unintended, but we really wanted to have this discourse and interaction. And then we took some of it back to kind of reheat this discussion and all these aspects around it, which might be the tactics. So probably we became aware of these strategic thinking and then thought, okay, it would be a nice tactic just to paint it black, because we could have painted anything else, but this would spark a discourse to all sides. And I also think that it's always, I mean, strategy isn't reserved for, you know, like some institution or administrative part. It's the same like if you work as an artist and you have a certain strategy of how to engage with the public and how to sell your work or how to make it relevant. And then of course you have all these tactics. And the interesting thing about the artistic tactics is that I think they really should use this privilege art has also by law, you know, like to really expand the realm of what's possible and really show a little bit this, you know, it's kind of a reality check of what's possible in a city, what's true. You know, you talked about the white American flags with Misha, where everybody thought, okay, the city is so safe, terrorism is in front of our doors, but it's more like the security dispositives of Foucault, everybody giving away their rights because they think, okay, there's an imminent danger, and then suddenly you have two artists walking up and everybody realizes that this image collapses. It's not, so, and that's a little bit, you know, like also the tactics then, like stretching the boundaries of what's possible, and of course, this is meant to be very visible. And so, to get back to the beginning, I don't think you really have a chance to avoid it, but you can be very aware of it and then have some strategic thinking to make this addition what comes out at the end. If it's something that benefits the public, is it something that benefits yourself, or are you taking advantage of?
May I add?
Yeah, please. I was about to head it to you. Stretching the boundaries, I was immediately thinking of the invisible playgrounds again. But go ahead.
As you said, strategies are not reserved for institutions, of course. I mean, also a strategy we use every day is taking vocabulary that city governments, for example, are using and reclaim them to make them understand what we are working on. And also strategy isn't, if you discuss it against tactic, it's nothing, I mean, it's something that you should take objectively, right? It's nothing bad to have a strategy. I mean, at the same time, you could take Adorno saying there's no right living in the wrong system. This is, you know, like you always have to have a strategy. And especially in the urban practice, we always claim that our work is relevant and that it has a goal and that it has a benefit in a way to cities or to the people living in the cities. And strategy in this case for me is how do you systemically observe this kind of claim, you know, like if you say, well, we're taking over Couvry-Brache to have a place that everybody can come, engage in, you know, urban garden or whatever, and how do you prove that it worked? And I mean, our work is not just about arts for the sake of arts, but for the city, right?
Unfortunately, I got a sign, time is over. I told you, 60 minutes goes by really quickly, and it's every time the same. The moment it gets interesting, the moment it gets heated is this when we have to depart, or we can continue, but without the audience. I would like to thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to thank you, Lutz, for joining us here today. Thank you, the audience, for being with us for this double feature again. This is Lutz Henke and Jennifer Aksu. And we are looking forward to seeing you again here at Living the City. Living the City is very much like you also described, something that we understand as an open process that is being created by all players, users, as you said it, the architects, the city planners, the inhabitants, the artists, civil society, politics. So thank you. Stay safe and see you soon. Bye-bye.